I'm lying on my back in the grass. I'm about 10 years old, maybe younger, maybe older. Who knows? My father's playing the Beatles' Red and Blue album. And as I lie there, watching the clouds drift by, I listen to the music in complete wonder. Many people can remember exactly when they first heard an artist, but with the Beatles, I can't. I know there must have been a first time, but I can't remember that moment because to me, it feels as if the Beatles were always there. What I do remember is lying in that grass, completely captivated by the pop perfection pouring out of those two albums. And that's why those Red and Blue compilations might just be the perfect place to discover the Beatles. But what if you could only keep one? Which would you choose, red or blue? The beginning or the end? We've put this off for a long time, even though no artist has been referenced more often on this channel than the Beatles. So often, in fact, that we turned it into a drinking game. Because whether we were talking about David Bowie, Fleetwood Mac, Frank Zappa, or 90s bands, sooner or later we always ended up back at the Beatles. But now, at long last, the wait is over. The Beatles' artist arc has officially begun, and we're starting where everything began for millions of music lovers, with two compilations, one red and one blue. And believe me, this turns out to be anything but an easy choice. Round up for pick one. The two compilations were released in 1973. By that time, the Beatles had already been broken up for 3 years, and all four members had already enjoyed their first solo successes. For those who didn't have the time, the patience, or simply the money to buy all their studio albums, these two double albums provided an almost perfect introduction to the most important pop group of the last 60 years. My father once told me that he made a very strategic decision and bought the Blue album first. He already owned several of the singles featured on the Red album. Those were the kinds of choices you had to make in a pre-streaming world.
You have chosen wisely.
And although the Beatles have released countless compilations over the years, the Red and the Blue have never really been surpassed. Take one, for example, released in 2000. A fantastic collection of 27 number-one hits. An absolute home run. But it also meant missing out on Strawberry Fields Forever, simply because it had never been a number-one single. Since then, both the Red and Blue albums have been reissued several times. And recently, they were even expanded with additional tracks. And while I certainly appreciate those additions, for this pick one, we're only considering the original versions. Although, in truth, these two albums are almost never in competition. They sit side by side, because as fun as the pick one game may be, when it comes to these two iconic compilations, everybody wins. But rules are rules. And that means it's time for round one. The rules of this game are simple. 1 point is awarded in each round, and by the end of all the rounds, we'll have a winner. For round one, we're not looking at the music. We're judging the packaging. Which cover appeals to me the most? The Red and Blue albums share more than just their names. Both sleeves are based on photographs by Angus MacBean, taken in exactly the same location. The stairwell of EMI House in Manchester Square, London. The photo used for the Red album was taken back in 1963 and originally appeared on the cover of Please Please Me. 6 years later, in 1969, MacBean returned to that very same spot to take one final picture. That photograph would later become the cover of the Blue album. As a result, these two sleeves really tell the beginning and the end of the Beatles' story. Even inside, the albums constantly echo one another. The gatefolds of the albums features the famous Strawberry Field photographs taken in Liverpool, presenting a band transformed almost beyond recognition by psychedelia, India, beards, and mustaches. And yet, the question remains simple. Which cover do I like better? In the end, I have to go with the Red album. Not because the Blue album isn't a fantastic sleeve, quite the opposite. But on the Red album, I see 4 young men who would become icons. On the Blue album, I mostly see the Beatles in their hippie phase, And while I absolutely love that era musically, I find the early Beatles just a little more timeless visually. Although I have to admit, my favorite Beatles photograph might actually be this one, the famous 1968 picture, where the band seems suspended somewhere between Beatlemania and Let It Be. No longer the clean-cut young men from the early days, but not yet the weary Beatles of their final years either. For me, this may well be the moment when the Beatles look their absolute best. And had this photograph been used on the Blue Album, the outcome of this first round might have been very different. But as things stand, the first point goes to the Red Album. In this round, we're not judging the quality of the individual songs as much as the way they're arranged. Which compilation feels the most like a real album? On paper, you'd expect the Red Album to have the advantage. The early Beatles still operated largely within the same musical universe. From Love Me Do to Eleanor Rigby, you hear a band evolving, but with a clear thread running throughout. As a result, the Red Album is an incredibly easy listen. There are few stylistic jumps, and the transitions from song to song feel perfectly natural. The Blue Album has a much tougher task. Here, the Beatles leap from psychedelia to rock, from Baroque pop to ballads, and from Sgt. Pepper to the White Album and Abbey Road. On paper, that should make for a less cohesive listening experience, but that's precisely where compiler Alan Klein deserves some credit. Because despite all those musical detours, the Blue Album never feels like a random playlist. It has an excellent flow, with peaks and quieter moments carefully balanced throughout. And that brings me to the conclusion that both albums do their job remarkably well. The Red Album may be a little more consistent, the Blue Album a little more adventurous, but both feel like complete musical journeys, and that's why this round ends in a draw. Current score, Red leads with 2-1. Which period had the greater impact on the history of popular music? And it turns out to be a surprisingly difficult question. Because the Blue Album represents what may well be the most artistically ambitious period of the Beatles' career. With albums like Sgt. Pepper, the White Album, and Abbey Road, the band kept pushing the boundaries of pop music further and further. Songs like Strawberry Fields Forever and A Day in the Life inspired generations of musicians and forever changed what a pop song could be. But the Red Album represents something that may be even more fundamental. Because before the Beatles could change pop music, they first had to conquer the world. This is where Beatlemania was born. This is where the British invasion began. This is where the blueprint for the modern pop group was laid. And without Love Me Do, She Loves You, and I Want to Hold Your Hand, there might never have been a Sgt. Pepper. In fact, without Red, there might never have been a Blue. Because as revolutionary as the second half of their career was, that revolution could never have happened without the unprecedented success that came before it. Blue changed the possibilities of pop music, but Red turned the Beatles into a cultural phenomenon. And that's why this round ultimately goes to the Red Album. Round 3, Red wins. In this round, we're not judging the quality of the songs, but the variety of the music. Which album takes you on the greatest musical journey? And perhaps nowhere is the difference between Red and Blue more obvious. The Red Album tells the story of a band evolving at breakneck speed. From the simple Mersey beat of Love Me Do to the sitar of Norwegian Wood and the string arrangements of Eleanor Rigby, you hear a group becoming increasingly ambitious. But despite that growth, there's still a clear thread running through the music. The Blue Album is a completely different story. Here, the Beatles leap from psychedelia to hard rock, from orchestral pop to blues, from the colorful universe of Sgt. Pepper to the raw chaos of the White Album and the polished elegance of Abbey Road. Strawberry Fields Forever, I Am the Walrus, while My Guitar Gently Weeps come together, Here Comes the Sun. No two songs sound alike. And that's precisely why the Blue Album sometimes feels less like a single style and more like a complete musical world tour. That's not a criticism of Red. Quite the opposite. The cohesion of the early Beatles is one of their greatest strengths. But when it comes to variety, Blue is simply unbeatable. And that's why this round goes convincingly to the Blue album. Round 4, Blue wins. Current score, Red still leads with 3-2. In which period did John, Paul, George, and Ringo shine the brightest as 4 distinct personalities? On the Red album, John Lennon and Paul McCartney are clearly the dominant forces. In fact, out of the 26 songs, Yellow Submarine is the only track not sung by either John or Paul. But that's not a criticism. During the first half of their career, the Beatles were, first and foremost, Lennon and McCartney. George Harrison was still developing as a songwriter, and Ringo had settled into his role within the band. On the Blue album, that picture changes completely. Here, all 4 Beatles get their moment in the spotlight. John delivers masterpieces like Strawberry Fields Forever and Across the Universe. Paul shines with Hey Jude and The Long and Winding Road. Ringo contributes one of his most beloved songs with Octopus's Garden. And George Harrison? He evolves from the perennial third man into a fully fledged creative force. With While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Here Comes the Sun, and Something, he contributes 3 of the crown jewels of the Beatles' catalog. For the first time, the Beatles no longer feel like Lennon and McCartney with 2 supporting players. Instead, they feel like 4 individuals creating something greater than the sum of their parts. Or, to put it more simply, on Red, you mostly hear Lennon and McCartney. On Blue, you hear the Beatles. And that's why this round goes to the Blue album. This round may be the most unusual of all. Because this time, we're not looking at the highest highs. We're looking at the lowest lows. In other words, which album lets you down the least? And yes, I realize I've just given away a perfectly good Don't Let Me Down reference. Because while the Blue album may contain more absolute masterpieces, it also has some bigger fluctuations. And part of that comes down to the fact that we're judging the original 1973 releases. Because quite a few gems are missing. Where are Dear Prudence, Martha, My Dear, Blackbird, Julia, and Mother Nature's Son? Where are Helter Skelter, Hey Bulldog, Two of Us, and the entire Abbey Road medley? And perhaps most painfully of all, where is she leaving home? Instead, we get a few songs that, personally, I rate just a little lower. As a result, Blue doesn't just have higher peaks, it also has deeper valleys. The Red album may be less spectacular, but it's remarkably consistent. From Love Me Do to Eleanor Rigby, you hear a band evolving, but rarely falling below a certain standard. There are no huge surprises, but there are hardly any disappointments either. And that's what makes the Red album so reliable. Because a compilation shouldn't just surprise you, it shouldn't disappoint you either. Or, to stay in Beatles terms, the Blue album may have Don't Let Me Down, but the Red album actually doesn't, and that's why this round goes to Red. Which compilation sounds the most impressive? And let me begin with a compliment for the Red album, because what the Beatles and producer George Martin accomplished between 1962 and 1966 is actually quite remarkable. Working with limited recording technology, 2- and 4-track machines, and a minimum of studio trickery, they managed to create a series of timeless recordings that still sound surprisingly fresh more than 60 years later. From the harmonies on Please Please Me to the strings on Yesterday, and the experimental sound effects of Yellow Submarine, you hear a band constantly moving forward. But on the Blue album, something extraordinary happens. Here, we no longer hear the Beatles simply recording songs. Here, they use the studio itself as an instrument. Tape loops, vari-speed, automatic double tracking, orchestral arrangements, reverse tapes, new instruments, and a level of production that was sometimes decades ahead of its time. Strawberry Fields Forever, A Day in the Life, I Am the Walrus. These aren't just great songs, they're technical masterpieces. And while the Red album has stood the test of time remarkably well, there's ultimately no competing with the revolutionary studio approach of the later Beatles. Because where Red shows us how well the Beatles could record, Blue shows us just how far they could push the possibilities of the studio. And that's why this round goes to the Blue album. Forget the sleeves, forget the historical impact, Forget the sequencing, the production, and all the other categories. Because in the end, it all comes down to one thing. We're only in it for the music. For this episode, I listened carefully to both compilations again and rated all 54 songs individually. And what struck me most was just how incredibly high the standard is on both albums. The Red album is a model of consistency. From Love Me Do to Eleanor Rigby, you hear a band evolving in just a few years from a fresh beat group into one of the most inventive acts of the 1960s. And along the way, we get classics like Yesterday, Norwegian Wood, In My Life, and Paperback Writer. But the Blue album has something that even the Red album can't quite match: the peaks, Let It Be, Across the Universe, The Long and Winding Road. And while the Blue album also has a few deeper valleys, and I don't personally rate every track equally highly, the number of absolute masterpieces is simply too great to ignore. My average score for the Red album came out to an impressive 8.1. The Blue album finished even higher, at 8.6. And that makes this the toughest round of all, because all the previous rounds were about the packaging surrounding the music. This round is about the music itself, and when I line up all the songs, add up the scores, and let my heart have the final say, I can only conclude that the Blue album contains the stronger collection of songs. Not by knockout, but on points. Blue wins. And that brings us to a final score of 5-4 in favor of the Blue album. Blue wins this edition of Pick One. And then there's one final question. No categories, no points, no spreadsheets, no average scores. Suppose someone said to me, you can only take one of these albums with you to a desert island. Which one would I choose? For the first 7 rounds, I chose with my head. In the songs round, I chose with my heart, but this time, I choose with my soul. And as difficult as that choice is, I would take the Blue album with me. Because in the end, it's the songs from the second half of the Beatles' career that I keep coming back to. These are the songs that stay with me. And so, we have our winner. By a score of 5-4, the Blue album wins this edition of Pick One, but somehow, it doesn't really feel like a victory. Because maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Maybe this episode was never really about which compilation is better. Maybe it was about where a love for the Beatles begins. And the answer to that question is surprisingly simple. Red, Blue, or both. Because as fun as the Pick One game is to play, these two albums were never meant to be rivals. They belong side by side, and perhaps the real winner was never Red or Blue. Maybe the answer was somewhere in between all along, and when I think back to that afternoon in the grass, when I was just a kid and first fell under the spell of the Beatles' pop perfection, I realized something. I wasn't listening to the Red album, and I wasn't listening to the Blue album either. I was simply listening to the Beatles. And maybe that's why choosing was so difficult. Because if nobody forced me to choose, I'd do it differently. I'd mix Red and Blue together. Because my ideal Beatles compilation wouldn't be red. And it wouldn't be blue. It would be purple, a personal selection of my favorite songs, an imaginary 1962 to 1970 compilation. Because in the end, as a child lying there in the grass, I wasn't listening to Red, and I wasn't listening to Blue. I was listening to music. And that was Pick One. That was the Beatles. Which of these two compilations would you choose? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to vote in the poll. And perhaps your own Purple album would look very different from mine. You can listen to my so-called Purple album, along with all the other music featured in this series, through the Spotify playlist. And be sure to follow the social media pages for all the latest updates. Because I will follow you if you follow me. After the breakup of the Beatles, Paul McCartney and his wife Linda released the album Ram. It featured Uncle Albert/Admiral Halsey, a magical, mysterious song indeed. Click on the card to watch my video about that song. Thanks for watching, see you next time, and in the meantime, drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.